Hello, and welcome to Building Sustainability Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Hart, aka Jeffrey the Natural Builder. Building Sustainability consists of conversations with designers, builders, makers, dreamers, and doers, exploring the wide world of sustainability in the built environment by talking to wonderful people who are doing excellent things. Welcome to the Solstice / Christmas / New Year episode of Building Sustainability. Hang on. Enough of that. It's a very strange Christmas for many in the UK this year and around the world. COVID and lockdowns have changed everything. So I wanted to do, as I have done since the first lockdown, and just give out a little bit more in the hope of keeping people entertained and occupied. So this is the first of 2 episodes with Janna Laan Lomas. Janna is the founding director and designer at Grain Architecture. So in this episode, I am talking with Janna about the more practical side of sustainable architecture. That's sort of looking at design details, materials and costs. In episode 38, we talk through Janna's background in sustainability, the need for community and diversity, the planning systems, Janna's background studying at CAT, and a bigger sort of topic of the ethics in the architecture industry in the face of climate change. So that's what's going on in episode 38. But I think both of these episodes are considered standalone. They are quite different. So just before that, as it's the end of the year 2020, I wanted to hit you with some podcast stats. At the time of recording this, Building Sustainability has had 40,918 downloads. Every month we're getting around 4,500 listeners at the moment, and each new episode is expected to get around about 1,100 listeners within its first 90 days. As it stands, our top 5 episodes are, at number 5, Barn the Spoon, becoming a full-time spoon carver. At number 4, Rob Hopkins, What If We Imagined a Better Future? Number 3, Hartwyn Natural Builders, which is the very first episode. And I think a lot of people listen to one and then they go to listen to that, which terrifies me a little bit because I wasn't very good at podcasting back then. Number 2 is Nick Hayes, Trespass, Crossing the Lines That Divide Us. And the number 1 podcast is Flo Hamer, Building a Tiny Home. So this year I've got to speak to loads of lovely people from many different areas. Some of them were my friends, some of them are now my friends, some have been my heroes, some have been my teachers, and an increasing number are great people who I've never met, who I've just read something about and want to talk to. And they have been happy enough to sit down and spend an hour talking with me about stuff. So a huge thanks to all of my guests over the last year and beyond. It's been an honour to speak to you and a joy to be able to share your work and your ideas with all of the wonderful listeners. Speaking of the listeners, that's you. A massive thanks to you, to everyone that's tuned in for this podcast. And thank you especially to all the people that have emailed suggestions or comments, or just to let me know how the podcast is helping them. Wanted to say a big thanks, as always, to Mike Bite Hill for the theme music. And my final thanks is the biggest, and that goes to my Building Sustainability heroes. These are the people on the Patreon site who give their financial support to the podcast. And it makes so much difference. Since lockdown number 1, I dropped a day from my working week to focus on the podcast. And your support really helps to plug some of the financial gap that has created. So the biggest of thanks go to Mari Ryan, Andy Bayliss, Scott McCauley, Keith McCracken, Rick Piper, Joanna Bradshaw, Wibbs Coulson, Ben, Samantha Fruith, James Wilson, Harold Pearce, Darren Shepherd, Adri, Philippe, Martin Doyle, Eleanor, Dominic, Emily Dawkins, Mr. William Smith, Chris Davey, Aidan, Sam Pointer, Ross Walker, Jim Jam, Amanda James, Tudor and Alastair. Thank you to all of those people. You are really incredible. I appreciate you so much. Okay, that's it for me. This episode begins with us talking about EcoBuild, which was a trade show that became Future Build. Enjoy the episode. Those eco builds, or future builds as they became, the feedback that we'd always get was, oh, I'm so glad that you're here, because otherwise, this entire show would be just plastic, concrete, foam insulation.
They call it eco build.
Yeah. Not meaning to knock it too much, but there was one year when the people opposite were selling plastic grass, and when they were asked why is that eco, they said, well, you don't have to water it.
A lot of that there, and it is really frustrating. I do kind of feel for the guy who runs it, or the people who run it, in that it's not easy, and a lot of the money, and this is the problem in society or in the industry, that the money comes from the big companies who are typically not doing things terribly well. The Celotex, Kingspan, these companies are the ones giving all this money. The Concrete Centre, I think, did a huge amount last year, and it's like, well, and then they give lectures on how green their products are, and you're like, that's totally the wrong angle. We should be promoting the alternatives to all those. Those are the reason. Those products are the reason we're in such a mess in the first place. Those products are the reason that the built environment is responsible for nearly half of global CO2 emissions, and it doesn't have to be, which is
What do you think we can do, or what are you doing maybe? Because natural materials don't have the voice or the money behind them to have the voice. They don't have the sway, the sort of lobbying, all the things that these big corporate machines have. So how can the little natural materials compete?
It is frustrating, because it's the people who are into natural materials and natural building that are doing it not for the profit, but for the love of the material, or the understanding that it is the right thing to be doing. And yet, because they're not just focused on making profit, they don't end up being able to compete with the big companies that are just all about the money, really. And so it is quite hard to get small companies to be on the same platform. And I suppose that's why the shows like Future Build are kind of at least a fairly good platform for that, because you are all there in the same room, the same space. You have people wandering around, and I think the NBUK idea of coming together and labelling us as under one name. We're not really a thing in ourselves. NBUK isn't really a company. We never actually incorporated it or made it that official, but it's just the kind of the group, the area that we create, because we know we're all working together to try and promote the industry as a whole. And I suppose strength is in numbers, in that sense, that if you come together as a group, we're perhaps our voices that little bit louder. We had a fantastic show one time with artisans of wood that came and did a round wood frame, and it was really nice. We had a bit of thatch on it as well, and it was a real eye-catching thing. It made quite a good impression. But artisans,
I was demoing notching straw bales around their frame.
Exactly.
That was good fun.
Had so much going on, and it got so much attention. We had this kind of advertising strategy, I suppose, of spreading straw throughout the whole hall. They didn't really like very much.
I think we kept one guy with a little vacuum or like a brush in full-time employment for that show, just chasing us around.
But it did attract a lot of people. I think that it's the tactility and the sort of raw honesty of what these materials are that people can really get their heads around it, and they just want to come and touch it. It's like, oh my god, it's an actual straw bale, as if it's this amazing thing, or this clay block. Wow, you just want to put your hands all over it, but actually it's just clay. It's mud and straw, and people know these things are. They've played with them as kids, but as adults, we kind of think everything's got to be, I don't know, highly processed and
packaged,
yeah, clean, and yet there's this excitement that comes out of people when they sort of actually get told, no, you can use this to build your wall. Have you actually it? And yeah, it's really fun seeing people's faces light up like that. Yeah, but
definitely.
Artisans, I think Artisans of Wood at that show, they are, I mean, actually they're called Built by Artisans now. I think they've changed slightly, but primarily they're sort of woodsmen, and they do a lot of work in the trees in the woods, and they don't really like coming to the Excel Centre for X days to be in that kind of environment. So it's really hard to pull these amazing people out of the woods and into these spotlights of surrounded by all the cement and plastic companies.
Yeah,
places
yeah.
of commerce.
I always found those events to be sort of, well, a very split feeling emotionally. I'd quite often end up being very, very drained by kind of everyone else there giving away their free plastic pens and, chatting about, oh, we've made our concrete 10% more efficient, aren't we, eco? That sort of mentality. But then equally, there'd be the core group of NBUK people who it just like filled my heart with like hope and optimism that they're good people, and you could come together and you could talk about things and you could share ideas and you could be inspired.
It's really encouraging, and that's one of the reasons I go back and keep doing it every year. You get that buzz from just seeing everybody who's fighting your corner, and it's really nice.
Yeah, nice. So I guess I'm interested to know your approach. I think in terms of the buildings you design, if there's particular techniques you favor, if things like that, if you were designing, say, your own building, that's probably a good question. Like what technologies and materials would you be specifying?
Well, that's a good question. Luckily, I've already designed my own house, so I know exactly how it would be made. I have so grain architecture kind of puts natural materials always first as the sort of the go-to. You start by aiming for the best, and you only kind of compromise when you have to. I think it's the wrong way around to sort of say, as many architects do in my experience, but we didn't go for something natural or eco because the client didn't ask for it. Well, that's completely the wrong way around. We're the professionals, and we should be putting the best the best thing forward as the primary option. And so that's kind of the ethos that we work by, that we're always aiming for natural or plastic and cement and steel free wherever possible. Obviously there's going to be some steel in some fixings. There's going to be possibly the odd membrane, certainly some tapes and things like that, but it's very minimal. Pretty much everything else that you have in a building can be natural, compostable, or recyclable. It's got a very low carbon footprint, or it can have a very low carbon footprint. Probably the highest carbon thing we use is lime, which is obviously got a bit of a carbon footprint to produce it in the first place, but it does at least capture the CO2 over its curing, as you know.
People listening might not know. Yeah.
And it eventually kind of becomes limestone again, effectively, which is how it's very different from cement, which will always be cement. And once I mean, you know all this, most of your listeners probably know all this, but it's once you start using natural materials, you kind of learn all these other things that aren't just about carbon footprint, but also about like the way that moisture moves through a building, and the fact that instead of trying to just slap on more seals and more waterproofing layers, actually letting the building, I think what is often called breathing, but really it's sort of the vapor open nature of it, that the humidity can dry out, not the air draft through the wall, which we don't want. But having that vapor open construction method throughout is, I think, really important to the longevity of the building, but also the health of the inhabitants, which is pretty important. That is what buildings are meant to do, is keep people safe and warm and healthy. So yeah, there's all those other things that come with it. And one of the first things I do when we have a client is to kind of try and explain all of that, I guess. The things that they probably don't get from architecture usually, or architects in general. Like go to an architect because you want an extension, and actually they end up with me lecturing them on humidity and carbon footprint, and trying to teach them about how they have options that aren't all plastic and breeze box.
Yeah. So I mean, do you favour a timber construction, a lightweight timber frame? I know that the building I built for you was a lightweight timber frame.
Yeah. It was. It had some thermal mass in that lovely floor of yours. I think, probably there's always the balance, isn't there, with thermal mass and insulation and lightweight and heavyweight building. I think understanding the client is really important. The way, if it's your house, in the way you want to live in that space. Do you want it to have a quick response to temperature change, or do you actually want it to stay very continuous and balanced? Thermal mass is brilliant at absorbing heat or cool and releasing it slowly, but it will release it on both sides. It radiates all over. Insulation will keep it on one side of the insulation, which is what's so different, and a lot of people don't get that. I think a lot of people think a green roof or a big cob wall is going to insulate, but it acts as thermal mass. It's not the insulation, so you need that as well. I would favour a mix, I suppose, having the right balance. If you have too much thermal mass, it's going to be really, really slow to heat up. But I think maybe the core of your house, which my house would be, hopefully one day that I will build, will be quite a kind of core central bit with your kitchen living space. That is, I think most people these days want to have like an open plan kitchen living room that they live in all the time, and that space, because you are using it all the time, is a good place to probably have some thermal mass. But then if there are spaces that you only go into for a couple of hours here and there, whether it's a study or not your everyday office, perhaps that's more, you're slower, you more want the thermal mass there, but shorter use space, you want to have a lighter construction type, really, so that it will react more quickly to you using it or heating it as and when you want to.
That's fantastic. I've never heard anyone say that before, actually.
Really?
Yeah. And it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I think it's sensible to understand the materials and put them in the spaces you want, how in response to how you want to use them. Obviously, you've also got the thermal mass you can use to absorb the heat from your fireplace or from the sun, from solar gain, particularly in winter and things like that, so you can use it cleverly as well. But
it seems like it's an often overlooked component in building the mass. People are very aware of insulation, and I think maybe because the mass is slightly harder to test for, a lot of thermal mass can appear to work like insulation. And there are, in fact, I know of a few people who are cob builders who don't understand the difference between thermal mass and insulation. They're sort of like, surely this is insulation because it's doing this a similar job.
So down, leaving the space, yeah, sure, but it will eventually absorb it and radiate it on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that's amazingly misunderstood, and I think insulation is talked about more because it is actually probably more important. I mean, you do need to keep the heat. If you're using energy to heat a space, you want to reduce that demand as much as possible, which means keep it in as much as possible. And I mean, yes, you can use thermal mass to do that, obviously, as well, and both together can work really, really well. But if you just had thermal mass, it takes a lot of energy to heat that up, and then you're losing it on both sides of that mass. So it's going to be much more energy saving to have super insulation rather than super thermal mass. I think if you wanted a sort of, the thing with thermal mass, if you have it on the inside of your insulation, then it's obviously going to store and release the heat or cool of your room, of your living space. That affects the temperature change. So if you turn the heating on, it's going to take a long time for it to heat up. If you, however, have the thermal mass on the outside of your insulation, it's going to have not such an effect on how quick or slow your space heats up from your heating, but it's going to have more of an impact on how your building as a whole reacts to temperature change from outside. So if it's a really, really cold spell for a week, if we get frosts for a week, having thermal mass on the outside of your building will reduce the impact that has on your internal temperature. So it can help keep the building warmer in winter. And likewise in summer, it can help give a sort of keep it cool when you have a heat wave. So it can be really cool in both scenarios. But again, it comes down to understanding how you actually want to use the building and where you want different effects and how much of it, because having a brick's worth of thickness of thermal mass is actually quite a good amount for most people's daily use and daily response to temperature change. Having 700 mil of rammed earth or cob, for example, has the daily changes of heat have barely any impact at all. But over a whole season, over a whole year, I mean, it will store the heat or cool from the summer and into the winter. Which is what they have at CAT, actually, in their large rammed earth lecture theatre. They have a 700 mil thick rammed earth cylinder, really, that is the lecture theatre. Amazing structure, but freezing in spring because it's got the cool that's it's absorbed over winter, but it's lost its warmth from the previous summer and it hasn't warmed up yet. And so it's it's a good building in some ways, but measuring the amount of thermal mass you actually want is quite important.
Yes, actual a knowledge of or an anticipation of how a building is going to be used is really important. And I really like that at the start of that you said, I tried to sort of push you into naming a way of building that you liked, and you very, very correctly said it's what the client likes. It's their listening to them is the important thing.
There's no one solution that's best, and that is, I think, comes back to the whole strengths and diversity. We don't want all buildings built of the same thing, but what we do want is to keep all buildings made of a renewable low carbon palette. But each individual, I think, has, and this is what's so exciting about architecture from a design point of view, is that you have the individual's response. You have your own likes and dislikes and your own ways that you use a building or use a space. And the joy I get from design and from creating those spaces is that you can respond to and kind of, I guess, improve the connection between how you you are as a person and how your space reflects that. So yeah, my own space, if I could create my own house, would be a very particular thing, but others would obviously like other things. There is a lot though when a client comes to me. It's very fashionable, I think, at the moment to have lots of glass and lots of big openings and everything, big open plan, big glass, and lots of white walls, and very sort of minimalist, and this very kind of, I suppose it's kind of trying to be very simple, because simplicity can be a very beautiful thing, but I think only when it's good quality and when it's done well, and when it's understood. And I think a lot of this big open or big walls of glass is actually not a very good way to design. I mean, it might look good in a photograph, but actually as a space to live in, it can be very exposing in terms of how you feel that the garden outside or the world outside is able to see in, and sometimes you don't actually want that level of exposure. So to be able to close it off is a good thing. Thermally, obviously, glass is never going to perform as well as something that is an insulation in a wall. So the more glass you have, the worse your building is thermally. And acoustically, which is often not considered in building, certainly in most clients' idea of a sort of extension to their house or something. They want these big open spaces, but actually from an acoustic point of view, glass is a really hard material, and it sort of echoes and becomes quite cold. And it's quite a dominating thing. So I think that my preference is always to say, well, let's kind of put glass where it's sensible to put glass where you've got a view or you need a connection out to a certain thing. You put glass where it's going to get some solar gain in winter, but you don't put massive glass like floor to ceiling glass on a north facing wall in the UK, because that's just going to lose heat. It's never going to gain sunshine. So I think, much like with thermal mass, glass should be used sensibly and understood as a sort of thing. It's got its own properties, it's got its own benefits, but use that to its advantage, not its disadvantage. And then the style kind of follows that. And also for me, and one of my, I suppose, pet hates with architecture is that people will get an old building and then kind of put this extension on it, which completely has no regard for what the building was, where the structure lines were, or where there was something coming down there, and there was a post there and a beam there and stuff, and you've just taken it all out and put a steel in and a load of glass in, and that's kind of, I mean, it's not really artistic. It's actually kind of disregarding what was there, and
quite disrespectful.
It is disrespectful, and it's also, to me, it feels unsettled. It's like the building isn't quite happy anymore because it's not got the balance. You can't read it in a nice kind of sensible way, and so for me it doesn't have a nice feel to it anymore. I think a lot of buildings get kind of ruined from that level of just open it up and change it.
I've got a question on glass, because I remember when I was doing my training out in Oregon, there was this sort of percentage banded about, that was a percentage of your floor space should be your glass space in a wall. Is that something that, or is that a thing? Is that something you're sort of conscious of?
There are definitely numbers to all of these things that, the regulations of this is the maximum or minimum that you're allowed of this, and it helps people to design within the boundary. I think if you actually understand the material and are using it sensibly, you do that intuitively, and you're kind of within those bounds anyway. But obviously those floor areas to glazing ratios can be really useful in certainly explaining to a client why they can't just wrap everything in glass because you're actually not allowed to, you know.
It's actually, is that a sort of planning thing or a building regs thing?
Requires you've got to meet certain U values basically for extensions or new builds, and it's very hard to do that when it's covered in glass. But also, I think if you have like a conservatory is considered a different thing from on a domestic building. You can have a conservatory because it's all glass. It's a bit ridiculous because people often heat them and they're not. I really don't like conservatories. I mean, a sunroom is different or a greenhouse is different. You know, these are great things, but
that's what. How do they differ? Like what? I mean, I've never thought of a sunroom to be any different from a conservatory.
So a sunroom, what I mean by that is a room where it makes the most of sun by having glazing in a place where it's going to catch some sun, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's all glass. So you might have a solid roof.
Okay.
And maybe walls up to window seat height or something. So you've got some solid insulated space and then some glass, which can be really nice. You're having a sort of a large window seat. I love a window seat in a southwest corner. Best thing ever. Definitely would have that in my house. And yet, you know, a conservatory has usually all sides glass, the roof is glass, and it's often these days double glazed and heated as a space because people want to use it all year round, and they don't, I think, appreciate that, you know, where conservatory started was kind of this glass room that wasn't heated. It was just a kind of room that you could use, but it's quickly become what people want to use all year round. A greenhouse is perhaps more what it has come from, in that you've got this nice space which does make great use of solar gain in some ways in winter. I mean, my garden office that I'm in at the moment has big south-facing window which opens into my south-facing lean-to greenhouse, which I got on eBay for 30 quid. And that's really great because it absorbs all this heat when it's sunny, even on a cold day, and then I can open the window and let some of that heat into the room, and it's brilliant. But yeah, you wouldn't, if the whole of my garden office was made of glass, then obviously I would both overheat in summer and get ridiculously cold in winter. So there's that.
Yes. Great. I wanted to come back again to something you've mentioned. You've just briefly mentioned membranes and tapes. I'm wondering how you feel they fit into a natural building.
I don't really like them generally, but at the same time I see the value in them at times, and I think that, again, like with so many other things, if they're used appropriately and not just everything wrapped in membranes, they are a higher embodied energy material. They are often using materials that aren't so renewable or natural. So to minimise the use of that is really important. I think you don't just wrap everything in membranes if you don't need to. I mean, I think on every project so far that we've done sort of concrete-free foundations, and then you build up from there with a slate DPC, damp-proof course instead of membrane, or recycle FoamGlas blocks or aggregate, which is insulation but also has no capillary action, so you don't need a membrane. So again, you're kind of using something. I mean, FoamGlas is high carbon as a material, but it also is from recycled glass. It's not toxic, and
it is in the UK or the European. I believe the stuff that's made out in the States is virgin glass.
Oh, really?
I think so. It certainly was when I researched it. I mean, this is old data. This was sort of 5-6 years ago.
Well, I hope they start to use recycled. Anyway, yeah, it can be a really good material to use, which avoids plastic at least, and allows for a good insulation underground under a solid floor, like a limecrete or earth floor. So that can be really nice.
it's my go-to. I sort of describe it as a bit of a wonder material because there isn't really anything else that has the same positive properties that I really, really desire.
Yeah, it is fantastic. And yet I still would say only use it where you have to. Because it is a high embodied energy material. It's not something that just because it's great means you should use it everywhere. You'd be sensible with it and say, look, this works really well in wet underground conditions as a damp proof layer and insulating layer and structural layer. Okay, let's use it just in those bits. So we often use it in a plinth wall as a block and under a solid floor, but that's it. Everywhere else we'll switch to timber, or I'd love to do something with more like adobe block. People want solid houses with blockwork walls, or adobe blocks, or strocks, as H.G. Matthews are doing one called strocks and things, and hemp clay blocks and all these other blocks would be really good as well. I think I'd favour timber a lot, but I'd like to explore more.
Some load bearing earth.
I think it's a great material.
Nice, I agree. And then you've mentioned concrete free foundations. I was wondering, I think maybe, I imagine most people listening to this are like, yes, concrete free foundations. But certainly the builds I did in the States, and then we get a lot of listeners in the States, concrete is so the norm that even their beautiful straw bale houses have a 400 by 400 concrete ring beam the whole way around the building.
In some places it's necessary for building control, which is really sad because it's so not necessary from a structural point of view. At least in the UK, at least we can argue that through having a structural engineer sign off the structural capability of something else like limecrete. I mean, what my go-to foundation would be is using a pit or trench of compacted aggregate, and then you either build a plinth wall off there, or you've got a sort of a slab with timber frame on top of there. So sometimes there's some limecrete needed, but that's kind of where I'd start. And again, you start with the best that you can do, and you compromise only where you have to. If there is, I did on one project, we had to underpin under a historic corner of the house, and unfortunately we had to use a tiny bit of concrete, but it was kept to just the minimum amount. The same with the workshops that you worked on. There was this moment where it was really frustrating because it's a light building that we did, and you think that that's going to need minimal foundations, but then the engineer's like, yeah, but it could get blown away.
It's too light.
Yeah, you actually do need. So there was one or two elements, a few points where we had to actually anchor it with something a bit stronger, and we ended up using a little bit of concrete, but it was really minimal, and the majority of the foundations were concrete free.
We worked very hard to use the absolute minimum, and it meant we had about 6 different foundation types throughout the whole building. It was it's hard to keep track of.
It was a bit frustrating, that, but I think probably having a good engineer on board really helps with that. If they kind of get it and they understand that that principle of don't just pour concrete everywhere because that's the easy answer. Start with the concrete free option, and then kind of only use it where you absolutely have to. And even if you have to, challenge it, because you often don't have to.
That's something I learned from Ben at Terra Palma, actually. He said, just whenever a structural engineer gives you something, just go back and say, no, I'm not doing that. And then get them to change their assumptions.
Yeah, it is a lot of it's based on assumptions, and obviously structural engineers typically will, and architects and builders and everybody will typically go for the easy option of what is normal and what they do everywhere, and it's a one solution fits all. And of course, again, that's what's led to so many problems. And certainly on a domestic scale, with doing one-story extensions or two-story buildings, new builds even, that sort of scale of building is very rarely really needs concrete in foundation. You can do an awful lot without concrete. I mean, concrete has its place under skyscrapers and airports. Not that they should really do a thing, but anyway. Yeah, it has its place. It's an amazing material that we should respect for how good it is at certain things, but only use it for those things where it has to be used, and use a better material for everything else, which you can use. You can use limecrete, or you can use compacted aggregate or ram tires or gabions or something.
Ooh, gabions. Oh, I don't know how I feel about gabions. So I did some research into them, and because we were going to use them on one of our projects, and the advertising for this gabion manufacturer said it'll last 50 years. It's like, well, that's not very long in the life of a building. That's pretty awful.
Well, yeah, a lot of building products are now they're sold as lasting 30 years or 50 years, and that is considered a normal kind of lifespan. I think they mean it's like guaranteed for that long, and typically on a lot of big buildings they do only last that long because people want to redesign spaces. But obviously houses can last hundreds if not thousands of years, and we should be building for a much longer lifespan, certainly longer than a human's lifespan. I mean, if we can't design a building that outlasts a human, we've really gone wrong. But a lot of these houses are kind of doomed not to last because of the way that they're built, I suppose. And so they just want to cover their backs and say it's only guaranteed for so long.
Yes. Okay, let's move on from that then. So here's a question that I know that you've got a good answer for, because I've heard it before, but it's one that I get asked a lot as a builder. How much does an eco home cost?
Oh gosh. How much does a house cost? I mean, it's so I think when you say eco home, do you mean a natural?
Yeah. Let's say they've seen something on Grand Designs and they want to build an eco house.
Well, one of the first things I do with clients is ask them to define what they mean by eco or sustainability, get that defined straight away, and set some standards of what you want to aim for. And I think it's, if you want to go for something that's efficient and high quality, you're going to spend more money on that, whether it's done with plastic and polystyrene or whether it's done with straw bales. You're likely going to spend more on good quality. I think most of the time when people want to do natural material based homes, they kind of go the whole hog, and they want to do it really, really well and insulate it to kind of, straw bale is basically passive house level of insulation, and if you take that as standard, which is what we typically do, then that's a huge amount of insulation, and it's going to be more expensive than just meeting building regs. That's because the quality is increased, not necessarily because you're using a natural material. I think that you could build just to building regs with something timber frame and something natural, and do it much more cheaply, but that's rarely done because people who start going down that route often see that they're going to get more benefit from building to higher standards. So the comparison with your standard brick and block is really hard to make. There's so much more to it than that. But also then you get the whole, well, how do you build it? And obviously you pay for a good contractor to come in and build it all for you. But with a lot of natural building, there's an element of self-build, and people like to get engaged, and that can sometimes bring the cost right down if you're building it all yourself. We've got some clients who built we did a straw bale roundhouse in Norfolk, I say we, I mean, it feels like it wasn't really us, it was them. The clients did it all themselves. We helped get them building control approval. But
I watched their build on Instagram.
yeah,
it was beautiful to
really,
watch.
Yeah, it's really lovely. It's taken a bit of time, but they've managed to do it with very little money. And it's beautiful and very high quality. So I think there's always a sliding scale. You've got three things of quality, time, and money, and you can't have all three at the top. Something's got to give. If you're willing to put in a lot of time, you can save a lot of money. You can do a lot of things by salvaging. I mean, this year we've spent a lot of time at home salvaging materials and building stuff basically for free, because we've been able to put that time in and that effort in. But if you don't have that, then you often pay for the convenience of time. So you're going to spend more. And equally, if you accept low quality, you're going to be able to save money. But I would promote good quality, in which case you're going to spend a little bit more. There's always a balance, and it depends on the priorities of a client as to how that goes.
Well, I was very impressed, and I've told a lot of people this, when we went for the initial client meeting with the Darlow family. The first meeting I ever went to with Prosecco as the standard. I was really impressed with how you got their budget, and then you gave them, from that you could find out what sort of quality of finish they were looking for, and then that gave them a footprint, and that gave a starting point for that would make a kitchen about this big, a living space about this big, and very quickly you could sketch out what's possible.
Yeah, definitely. It's always productive to take a pencil and paper to a initial meeting and scribble stuff so that you can get a response straight away. I can't actually remember what that was a few years ago, what their budget was, but I think we said back then that the cost, as I would often say to clients, the cost varies between I think typically now I'd say like £1,500 a square metre to £2,000 a square metre, somewhere in there. Obviously it can go a little bit either way, but if we took a sort of middle ground of that and said, okay, if we're going to assume it's around, for ease of maths, let's just say it's £1,500 a square metre, then you've got a budget of 200,000 or thereabouts, or 300,000. From that how much space roughly you can therefore afford to build at that budget, and give or take a bit depending on if you want something that's extra special, then maybe you have to give a little bit of space somewhere else and make it smaller. So that's typically how I would start to get someone's aspirations a little bit more grounded, I suppose. Sometimes
it's an issue I've seen it firsthand, where clients have gone to an architect and said, this is what I want, and then the drawing, they've paid for their plans and their drawings, and they've got all excited because all their sort of needs are met, and then they take those plans to a builder, and the quoted price is vastly more than what they've told the architect.
I've had that happen as well, because I think usually that's because they've gone to a builder who doesn't understand the materials, or hasn't worked with them before, doesn't know where to source them, and is kind of thrown. So they add contingency. Typically a QS does the same thing. They see something that's not normal, brick and block, and they'll add X amount extra, and suddenly, as with the project you worked on of ours, the workshops in Suffolk, they went to a QS the first time round and were told a ridiculous cost, which almost stopped the project going ahead entirely. And it had to be redesigned really, really small in order to get it in budget, and it was still expensive, because the builders were sort of thrown by the materials. And then we went on that journey of I showed you a sketch on a napkin, basically saying, what do you think of this? And suddenly, because we approached builders who were kind of on the right wavelength of the right materials, thinking of things in a different way. It was something that was achievable within budget, and we got it to go a little bit bigger again. So we got that space a bit better, and it certainly is not your standard brick and block building. It's a beautiful space, very beautifully crafted by Hartwyn and team. So I'm really proud of that, and I've enjoyed going to visit and seeing and dining even in the space, which has proved really valuable, especially in lockdown, because there's the covered sort of outdoor dining space, which obviously we've been able to sit more than 2 meters apart. But yeah, sit outside in that space, and the clients, they've really enjoyed using that space. So we've got a lot more from it than we thought, and it was still pretty near to budget, I'd say, compared to what it was originally going to cost. I'm certainly happy with the building. I think it's come out really well.
Great. I'm very happy with the building. Yeah, it was. I was thinking about it the other day because I find myself often thinking about this balance between sort of hippie building, building with straw bales, all wobbly walls, and sort of, my focus is, and I've talked about this before, but my focus is very much in trying to make buildings that people don't necessarily know they're an eco home. They're just calling them a home. And so it sort of appeals to them on sort of quite a conventional, it could just be whatever conventional construction. So quite flat walls and things like that.
The workshops they were a nice mix, I think, in that they had a little bit of wobbly round wood, but most of it was pretty clean.
Yes.
Straight lines, and quite smart.
We spent a long time flattening, straightening, building out, because that's certainly that's the aesthetic I enjoy.
Yeah, I think so. I think also it's quite nice when you have something that is pretty much straight and flat, but it's just subtly handmade. It's not like it's absolutely perfect machine cut. It has some quite subtle kind of individual handmade look about it. It's crafted. It's not that doesn't mean it has to be taken to extreme and gone really wobbly and kind of have handprints and everything, because that's a very different aesthetic. But just subtly showing that something has been handcrafted, even if it's quite a normal thing, can make the feeling of it become really enjoyable. I think I was thinking about this a lot lately, that I think a lot of what's important in life in general is our connection to things, and whether that's the people around us or the spaces or the things we have. And I think when you can see something, or you're in a space which feels like it's involved people, or you can read it really well because it's honest in its materials and things, you have a better connection with where it's come from, or what it really means, or what's gone into it, the effort, the love that has gone into making that thing. And so it creates a really nice space. You feel better connected in that space. So that doesn't sort of have that much impact on the aesthetic, whether you like a style which is quite sort of clean and straight, or whether you like a style which is quite sort of rounded and wobbly. But I think the same thing applies, that if you can see that somebody has cared about it, or you can see sort of where it's come from and the journey that thing has had, then you feel a lot happier about it and living in it.
Thank you, Janna, for an excellent conversation. If you haven't heard the other part of this, then head on over to episode 38 for more. And this is me just wishing you the best at this tricky time of year. Whatever festiveness you may or may not be celebrating, and I'm aware that probably quite a lot of people are now listening to this in June or something, so it's not entirely relevant. those who are here with me at the moment, at this solstice, Christmas, New Year time, I hope that you stay safe and happy, and remember to pick up your phone and call anyone who might be alone at this time. It will make the world of difference. So that's it. See you in 2021. It might not be starting well, but it's going to be great at the end. See ya! Enough!